now it's time to talk about adding effects to the layers in After Effects. And this is also one of the very basics of what you do in After Effects. You could say that there are two major things that you do in After Effects. One is that you blend images together, and that is what we have been seeing here, that you have two different layers and then you combine them in different ways. The other thing that you do in After Effects is that you make changes to the images. It could be that you add stuff like film grain or simulated lighting effects or simulated lens flare and so on. Or it could be that you change some of the image attributes like the saturation, the lightness and so on. And we'll see how this is done. To make it really simple, we can use just one of the shots here. We center that one. The effects in After Effects are, so to speak, hooked onto the layers. And in order to see what effects that you have on a layer, we have to look in the timeline. In the timeline, you have the effects. Over here is a small arrow. If you click on this one is very important. If you click on this one, then we see that there is a group here called transform. If we click on this one, you can see that this almost works like a folder collecting a number of effects. And these are the default effects that you have on a typical video shot. So as soon as you bring down a video clip on the timeline, that layer with the video clip automatically gets these effects. And as you see, they're quite obvious. It is position, it is scale, that is size, and rotation and opacity. If I change this one, you will see the change, of course. Let's do the rotation, for example. And there are two ways of changing these settings. I can either click and drag. And as you see, the number here changes while I do this, while I rotate. And by the way, you can also see that there is a point around which the rotation occurs, right here in the middle. And that is the anchor point. So if I change the anchor point a little bit, I move it over to outside the character's face here, and I rotate again, then you see that the rotation is now around another point, this point here. And if I change it back, the rotation will be around the character's eye again. So the anchor point can be quite important, especially when you do rotations, of course. So that is one way of changing these attributes here. Click and drag. The other one is click and right, you could say. Now the rotation is -10. Let's say that I wanted it to be 45 instead. Then I can click and type 45 on the keyboard and then enter. And then I have that one instead. So that's the basics of effects and changing the attributes of the effects. But let's see what effects we can add besides these ones. On the right here in the interface we have a window that is called Effects and Presets. And this one is quite crowded here, as you see, so you can, let's see, we can close this panel over here like that, and then we have some more space here. You can actually rebuild the interface of After Effects very much by grabbing stuff, moving it around like this, and grabbing the top of this one and move it around and so on. let's see, we can move this one down here, for example, so we get even more space for the effects window. And also under Windows, here are all the different windows that we can open up in Premiere, in After Effects. So as you see, there is lots of more things that you have. Under workspaces, there are different configurations of the window, and actually you can make a new workspace. So if you have a configuration of all these windows that you like and you often want to use, then you can create that one and reuse it over and over again, like your own personal configuration of the window. Okay, we were talking about the effects, and in the effect window here we have lots of different effects gathered in all these different folders, as you see. And as I said, many of these effects are about changing the aspects of the image, the color and so on. And as you will notice, if you are familiar with Photoshop, most of these effects are the same effects that you have as filters in Photoshop, and they work very similarly. So it's a big advantage if you are accustomed to the filters in Photoshop. And let's pick a couple of them. One obvious is of course blur and sharpen. Sharpen is basically meaningless. It's very seldom that you want to sharpen an image, and you can't really make an image sharper. It just looks strange. But often you need to make it blurred, and there are lots of blur, as you see. Lens blur is a very good blur that blurs the image in a way that is very similar to how it looks when the image in the camera is out of focus. It looks really authentic. Gaussian blur is a much simpler blur, but it is also much faster. And those are the ones that I usually use. So let's test one of those. I can add it by dropping it in the display window here. But if you have many layers, it can be difficult to actually decide on which layer the effect should go on. So that is much easier here in the timeline. So I drag the effect down to the layer in the timeline and drop it. As you see here, what happens is that I get a new folder here called Effects. And under that one we have the Gaussian blur. Before I try that one, let's try another one, like color correction. There is lots of different color corrections, as you see. Many tools for that. And I really recommend that you try them out and find your own personal favorite in changing colors. And of course, depending on why you want to change the color and what kind of result you want to achieve, these ones are sometimes you need one of them, sometimes you need another, of course. The ones that I usually use is the color balance here, HLS. We can add that one as well. Then we have this one here, the Gaussian blur and the color balance. And then levels is very nice as well. So let's add that one. Those are my favorite tools for color grading. And if we look over here to the left, you can also see that instead of the project bin is still around here, but there is a new tab called Effect Control. But at the same time, down in the timeline, you see that if I open up the Gaussian blur, I have blurriness, for example, as an attribute that I can change. And if we look in the effect window on Gaussian blur, you can see that we have blurriness there as well. So you could say that in the timeline you have a kind of subset or a minimized version of the representation of all attributes that you have on an effect. And you can control most of the effect in the timeline. But then there are some things, like in the levels, for example. If I open up levels here, I only have 3 different options. But if I look at levels in the effect control, I have much more options. And I also have this histogram, which makes it easier to change the image. So some effects, it is okay to only control them in the timeline, but some other effects you have to go up into the effect control. But let's start with the simple one, the blurriness here. And the Gaussian blur is very simple. Either you have minimum blur, like now, 0, or you have more blur, or even more blur. And as you see, I click and drag to control the attribute, or I can click and write here as well. And this is how the effect looks, blurry. One thing that I often want to do is that I temporarily want to disable effect. It might be that I have many different effects and I want to single out one effect and only work with that one, or it might be that I'm not really sure if it will be better or not with or without the effect. So then you want to turn on and off the effect, and that is what I do with this FX icon down here, switching it on and off like that. If I decide that I don't want the effect at all, then I select it in the timeline or in the effect window and press delete on the keyboard, and it's gone. So what's next? It's the color balance. The fine thing with the color balance, and we can look on that one here in the timeline as well. The fine thing with color balance is that it very clearly separates the hue of the image, the lightness of the image, and the saturation of the image. So that I can manipulate those two separately. And that makes it very easy to see what the trouble with the image is and so on. It might be that it's the hue. I want it to be a little bit more greenish, yellowish, and so on. So that's the hue of the image. It might be that it's a little bit too dark or bright. I can change that. Or the saturation, that I want to over saturate it, or might be a little bit more common that I want to bring down the saturation in a more subdued style like this. So that's what you do with the color balance. Let's take that one away, and then we have the levels remaining here. And the levels, I need the control effect window to manipulate. The levels are very good because it's a very good way of changing the grayscale of the image. And by sliding these sliders here. And you very clearly see the changes that is done. So it's very intuitive. This is very similar to what you have in Photoshop. One thing that is important with the levels is that what I did now was that I made a change for the whole image, all the colors, but I can also select to do it only on one of the channels, like the red. And that is also one way of changing the color grading of the image. So actually, you might not need the color balance or something like that. You can do very much with just the levels effect. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I like the levels so very much. It is very easy to use, but very powerful and flexible as well. So that was the effects, and in the next screencast I will talk about animating the effect.